Okay, for those of you who have not met Michelle yet, she works with our company, Social Engineer. This is Michelle Fincher. Michelle doesn't like to brag, so I felt that I had to do the intros because she's awesome. So Michelle is a psychologist. She's an ex-U.S. Air Force Academy professor, and she's small and Asian, which means she's like the perfect social engineer. So I don't even know how you get around any of this. She's our secret weapon, okay? And what she's going to talk to you about today is psychology and how it ties into social engineering. So everybody, big round of applause for Michelle.
Well, the good news is I know you all are here for Kevin Mitnick, so you are my captive audience for the next 50 minutes or so. So that's awesome for me, of course. Thank you for coming. I think a lot of people have questions about psych, which are kind of interesting. Who all here took psychology in some form, high school, junior high school, college? Okay, so you have been exposed to a lot of the studies that I'm going to talk about today, but what you have to understand is that a lot of these are old, they're classics, and they're relevant because they're not necessarily things that we can repeat today. Psychology studies, at least the classics and currently, they have to go through a barrage of they have to pass a lot of hurdles before they're considered appropriate to be tested on humans. Back in the day, we didn't have those problems. So a lot of the information that we had is stuff that we can no longer replicate, at least in the US. Sometimes they do it over in Europe because they're still awesome. But let me ask you guys a question. So you all have had an exposure to psychology. You will have heard about a lot of these experiments. But really what I'm interested in is whether or not you can apply them to the things that you're doing as social engineers, hopefully good as opposed to malicious. So here's the first question. We all got into tech so we wouldn't have to deal with people. So what is the deal? So why am I talking to you guys about psychology, a subject that many of you probably cut to do, I don't know, programming. Yes, sir. Yes, and that is something that you've probably heard over and over and over again. We're here at a hacking conference, and there's going to be all sorts of great information about exploits and ways to look at information and ways to gather information. But what we find over and over again is that the humans are the weakest link. So basically, there's no such thing, at least not until we get to Terminator, which we're rapidly approaching at this point. But basically, understanding all this stuff means really understanding your people. And I think all of us go to the default of saying, stupid users, people are dumb for making the decisions that they make. But really what we want to know is we want to understand why they make the decisions that we do, and understand the fact that a lot of this stuff is hardwired and based in survival, okay? So back in caveman days, if I was the one that was going out to try the really colorful berries, what happened to me? I died, yeah. So a lot of the reactions that we have are based on basic survival. And so really, if you have an understanding of this is going to lead to better programs, better education, better policies. And for those of you who are in the business of testing your companies, it's going to lead to better testing that makes sense and really looks at the mistakes that people make on a very human level. All right, so let's get down to it. Back in 1919, and this is, again, a really, really long time ago, we didn't have a great understanding of the way people did things and the decisions that they made. Does anybody know who the baby in the picture is? Albert, little Albert. So back in the day, now here's something to understand, and those of you who are parents will understand this. Babies react naturally to a few things. Being dropped, okay, is a very natural reaction. Loud noises is a very natural reaction. But other than that, babies aren't going to react to some sort of external stimuli such as a little brown bunny, or in Albert's case, a little white rat. So John Watson set out to understand how hardwired reactions are connected to things or stimuli that aren't necessarily natural. So what he did was he exposed little Albert, who was theoretically a healthy 9-month-old infant. He exposed him, first of all, to a rabbit, to rats, to a fur coat, to actually a pretty scary Santa Claus mask. And what he found was that little Albert reacted very neutrally to these stimuli. So he thought, okay, now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pair these stimuli with something that babies are naturally afraid of. So for a while, every time that a white rat or a rabbit was dropped onto little Albert's lap, he would hit a metal bar against another piece of metal really loud, creating that natural fear reaction. I know, this is really sad, right? So after a while, what he found was that every time a rat was dropped onto little Albert, he would cry. And you guys know why, right? You're nodding, gentlemen, here in the front. Yep, so we've got classic conditioning going on. So we've got a fear response that has been associated with a stimulus, and unfortunately what they found was it generalized. So not only was Albert afraid of rats, he was afraid of rabbits, he was afraid of fur coats, he was afraid of the Santa Claus mask after a while because it had become paired with something that was very scary. So what we found, basically, was that something that's hardwired, like a fear response, can be associated with something that is not natural to react to. Who here has ever had food poisoning in your life? Okay? So, the next time I was in Panama, got a bad lobster, could not look at lobster for another 15, 20 years. Now, what we understand is that is a really strong reaction, right? Why is that such a strong reaction? Survival, exactly. If you didn't get sick to the things that were really bad for you, you probably didn't live to reproduce. So this is something that we really understood after little Albert. Now, why might the little Albert experiments be a little controversial? Yeah, we don't like to do that to babies, at least, not that we speak about anymore. So, but what we found was that something as simple as a fear response can be associated if the connection is strong enough, and something like food poisoning is really strong. So if it's a survival mechanism, that connection can be immediate. It only takes one night of puking to understand that you shouldn't eat that again or make you not want to eat that again. What we also found that these associations can be generalized. So it wasn't just the white rat, it was the rabbit, it was the fur coat, it was anything that was nice and warm and fuzzy. What else did we find out? Yeah, we already know that. So, this is the concept of classical conditioning and creating a response between something that is hardwired and something that is not. Why am I talking about this in an SE session? Yes, sir. Okay, so let me ask you guys this. Anybody here like doing IT security? Many of you, yes. What is the response when you walk into a room? Yeah, okay, so basically the bottom line is people can be conditioned to respond in certain ways. How is your population conditioned to respond to emails? Delete, if you're lucky, yes. But generally? Okay, that's what we really are hoping for, is that we want to create an association between getting something and doing something. And so this is important to understand that really what we want is our folks to associate us with good things, and we want to associate certain stimulus with the response, because really, think about it this way in terms of behavior. What are people conditioned to do when asked for help? Many times will help, okay? So keep that in mind. So classical conditioning is just where we start and is just sort of the really basic introduction to kind of SE and psychology. The next thing we're going to talk about, in 1951, there was a social psychologist named Solomon Asch. He did a really simple, interesting study where he took 6 people, sat them at a table, and showed them pictures of lines and asked them each to do a comparison and say which line was the most similar to the one presented to them. What was unknown was that let's say 6 out of the 7 actually worked for Dr. Asch, and 1 person was the person being studied. Okay, so here was the test. Not really hard, okay? Which one is the most similar to the comparison line? Guess which guy was the one that didn't know he was part of an experiment? Yeah, that guy. So here's what's important to understand. When presented with a task where they had to report out loud, okay, and this guy was near the end of the line, and he heard the answers that everyone else was given, what he found was that about over 30% of the time, people conformed to the group even when it was blatantly wrong. Depending on the conditions, that increased or decreased. So this is a concept of conformity. We talk about it in terms of being social proof. There are subtleties. You guys probably heard about peer pressure as well. But basically, our environment has a very strong effect on how we react and what we react to and the choices that we make. Now, why is this relevant to the social engineer? Yes, sir?
Because we can peer pressure people into doing behaviors that we want them to.
Yes, absolutely, Gary. Thank you. So we know that conformity can work against us or for us if we're the social engineer. So basically what we know is that people will yield to those around them, right? If there's a group of people and we're all doing something, here's the situation. This is my dilemma always, and I talk about this in class. I walk into a place where I walk up to the counter and I order food, but then I go and sit down and people bring the food to me. Do I tip? I don't know. I don't know. It's an ambiguous situation. Anybody ever work in the service industry before? What do you do at the counter? You have a tip jar. And what do you do with that tip jar? You seat it. And that is because folks in that industry understand that in an ambiguous situation, most of us will look around to our group around us to decide what to do. So here are some things that affect whether or not you can get someone to conform. The ambiguity or uncertainty of a task. So in my situation, like if I go to McDonald's, I know I'm going to order what I order, I'm going to get my food, and I don't have to tip. I know if I go to a really nice restaurant, my boss is expected to tip. I'm kidding. But in that really ambiguous situation, I don't know whether I should tip or not. And so what we do understand is that when the task is really sort of uncertain or we don't really know what's going on, most of the time we are going to look around us to see what to do. Secondly, whether the task is public or private. So in Dr. Ash's experiment, there were several conditions that they chose. The public reporting one was where each person said aloud the number of the line. And as it grew more and more evident, there was more and more pressure on the one guy who was the stooge to conform. When we have to do this in a very public venue, we're much more likely to conform, right? It makes sense. We don't want to be the guy that sticks out. We don't want to be the guy that gets killed. So, but what he did find was that the task wasn't that hard. So in control situations where people could just report whatever they wanted, or in situations where people could write on a piece of paper, it was like less than 1% that people reported the wrong answer. So we do know that when we're in a public situation and people are looking at us, that there is a very strong consensus and there is a pressure on us to conform. How many others in the group? So if it's just like you and one other guy, not a big problem, right? You're going to give the right answer, and it's not going to be an issue, and you're not going to feel weird or stupid. But as the numbers grow and the consensus grows, it really becomes problematic because now you're like the guy that's sticking out. And I think all of you can probably relate to this. This isn't rocket science, but it was relevant at the time because what we didn't realize is that conformity is a really strong aspect of our behavior. We're social beings. We grew up in tribes. It was important to our survival. So anything that made us stick out as an individual was something that was dangerous to us. So think about that in terms of social engineering. So how can conformity be used against or for a group of people? How about electronic communications? Facebook.
Post similar things to all of your friends. You don't want to post something that's completely different from their topics of interest.
Okay? So if your friends are posting and liking things, you may feel compelled to do that. Let's get even more basic about social media. Fake profiles, sure, absolutely, and we have seen that used. If we look at news reports, we've seen stories where people are faking social media accounts, faking individuals, and then becoming friends with those people. Yes, sir? Okay, that's great. So that is getting a communication from somebody who is known or known to others? Yes, absolutely. Yes, sir? Sure, absolutely. I think that's a great point as well. So we can talk about how deadly this is in sort of electronic communications. What about impersonation? Yeah, that's really loud. Ooh, becoming part of the tribe by looking in very similar in fashion. Yeah, absolutely. So you guys get it, right? There's actually a basis behind it. Dr. Ash proved it in 1951, and we still know it today that conformity is one of those strongest pressures that create a series or a need to yield based on human influence and based on the way that we're hardwired, okay? So we're not mindless and stupid sheep. Kids and teenagers are yielding to peer pressure, but it is because this is a very strong mechanism in all of us. And I think, again, as we understand that better, we'll understand why it's not because people are mindless sheep, but because there really is a basis for it. And really, it helped us survive in the past. Okay, and finally, status of the group. You know, if you feel like you're higher status than everybody else, then it doesn't really make a difference. You feel totally okay being the outsider. But if you feel like everybody knows more than you, or is higher status, or is richer, or is whatever, they're a celebrity, then again, you're going to feel forced to yield. So think about the kinds of conditions that you can change and manipulate in order to create compliance on your part in terms of your testing. And that is something that again, is one of the strongest factors when it comes down to human influence. All right, so we've talked about classical conditioning, and we've talked about this idea of conformity. Let's move forward a little bit in time. And now we get to 1961 and Dr. Stanley Milgram, who was actually a student of Dr. Ash. And he was really interested in sort of looking at a very specific aspect of conformity, and that is how we conform to authority figures. So this is the setup, right? You've agreed to participate in a learning experiment. You're split up into groups of two. You've got a teacher and you've got a learner. The task is to memorize word pairs, all right? And as the learner, you're strapped to a chair, and every time you get the word pair wrong, you get a slight electrical shock. You can see here that it starts here at 15 volts. The shock is very slight. And this is a picture of the actual panel that they looked at. It goes all the way up to XXX, past danger severe shock, 450 volts. Now here's the interesting things about the Milgram experiment. The learner, the guy getting the electric shock, was actually part of the experiment. The shock wasn't real, so the only person being experimented on was teacher. Milgram was interested in our level of obedience or compliance to an authority figure. And he varied the conditions. This is a controversial study, as you can imagine. But what he found was that depending on the conditions, over 2/3 of the population was willing to go all the way to 450 volts severe shock. Now, that sounds really scary, and I think it's scary to all of us to think that we would be willing to administer what is potentially fatal shock to somebody that we don't know simply because we're told to. But really, it came down to the authority figure and the conditions under which they were asked to do so. So if you have a doctor who's running an experiment from Yale University in a lab coat, you're much more likely to get compliance than if you're Peter in his cargo pants and a black t-shirt. So we know that, but here's the thing to take away then, is that we have conformity, and if you are able to create a vision of authority, you're much more likely to get obedience. So let's take a quick look at a clip, and this is actual footage. This will show actual footage from the Milgram studies. And I've got no sound. Try it.
In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities.
Sorry. Everyone give a hand to Evan, our sound guy. Yay. Now it's going to blast everybody's ears out. Are you ready?
Touches the heart. He set up an experiment.
That's even worse.
They were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Here we go.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
He refuses to go.
Something important to note here. What did the researchers say to gain compliance? Please continue. So this is something that's really interesting. Nobody held a gun to this guy's head. Okay, someone just asked him politely in an authoritative fashion to please continue with the experiment.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
Can't
here.
stand it. I'm not going to kill that man, eh? I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next with slow.
Okay, here's another really important point. Who was responsible for the actions? The doctor, okay? So there is a transfer of responsibility that takes place. If this guy dies, who's going to have to answer for it? And so, again, there is a tendency for all of us when we are in the presence of an authority figure to transfer that responsibility. And what that does is create a condition where we're sort of mindlessly going along with things. So, again, think about the SEA applications when we get to it.
Oh, walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering for less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
So, why would this guy comply? Now, we're talking about authority, but we're also talking about a lot of different concepts as well. All right, so we yield to legitimate authority figures. We transfer responsibility to them, but what else is going on here? certain conditions make a difference. The Milgram experiment was replicated a number of different times with a number of different conditions. Some all the way up to the conditions under which teacher had to hold the guy's arm down onto a shock plate to administer the learning experience. As you can imagine, that started to drop off in terms of compliance. There were conditions under which the authority figure was behind a curtain. As you can imagine, that also created conditions under which people felt better about disobeying. But if you've got a legitimate authority figure who's standing in front of you, asking you to take an action, it becomes very difficult to resist. So this has been replicated a number of times. In fact, fairly recently, there was actually a game show in France where they had a guy who would answer quiz questions and then the audience would say whether or not they should shock him. So you can YouTube this. You can see all sorts of conditions under which people are willing to do this. Now, this sounds really horrible, right? This just sounds like we're bad people and we're going to do bad things. But think about another condition as well. Chris has talked about this, and you've heard this, all week in here. Once you get someone to say yes, it becomes a whole lot easier to yield. Let me go back to the picture of the actual device, okay? 15 volts, that's a little tingle, right? That feels okay. Clearly, if you start at 450 volts, that's not okay. At what point do you start to feel like it's not okay? Now, if you've already agreed to 15, and you've already agreed to 30, and then you go to 45, and you're getting more uncomfortable, what has happened at that point? You're desensitized, absolutely. And what else? You are absolutely complicit, and why does that create greater obedience? Yeah, right? We've done it and we're doing it up to this point, so it must be okay to continue. Again, we've got that transference of responsibility. Yes, sir? It's just, yeah. We're only going up 15 volts at a time, and that's what's really hard for people is that they have agreed at a certain point to say it's okay, and I'm participating in the experiment, right? And I don't want to mess things up, so at what point does it become not okay? And that's a really hard decision point for people to make. So think about the applications as far as getting people to comply on an SE engagement. Yes, Gary?
If we do it with our already previous actions, so since we want to seem consistent ourselves, we keep doing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talk about that in our class as well. Consistency is very important, or being a consistent individual. What do you guys think of the person, at least after they're 18 or so, that keeps changing their mind about things? They're untrustworthy, they're unreliable. I think all of us like to feel like that we're reliable, consistent people. And so if we change our mind at a certain point, what kind of a person does that make us? We don't want to be seen that way, and all of us like to be sort of consistent in what we say and what we do. And that's actually a really important point because social engineers will get that commitment from you and then expect you to carry it out and feel totally okay about it. So, in terms of obedience, we know people yield to authority figures, and certain conditions will definitely make a difference. We also know that once you get someone to yield, it gets easier and easier. So what are some things that you could do to create authority in how you come across to people?
Dress.
Dress, Peter. For instance?
I think somebody is sued would be more authoritative than somebody who's walking like this.
Okay, so how you dress is going to affect how the level of authority that you have? Sure. Yes, sir, back there. How do I sort of project confidence? Oh, this is great. Stand up for me, please, sir. Stand up on the chair for me, please, sir. Okay. Give me a superhero stance. That was good. I like that. I'm not done. Come on. If I was sweet and I asked you to give me a superhero stance, what might it look like? Ooh. Ooh. Now, y'all give him feedback. What sort of things are sort of expected in a superhero stance? Ooh, hands on the hips. Hands on the hips. What else? Oh, we've got the puffed out chest, the chin up, okay. All right. Not bad, right? So we all understand that this is a confidence pose. This is a superhero stance. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Everybody give him a hand. Now, here's the next one. Let me, this gentleman's been so wonderful. Stand up on a chair, please. Don't kill yourself. All right. Give me insecure 14-year-old girl. That's not bad. I like it. Now, what sorts of things, Chris just talked about, what sorts of things gave you sort of the keys? Yeah, but what? What in his body language? Okay, facial expression. So, yes, sir. Oh, yeah, made himself smaller. Yes. What else? Okay. So yes, one more. Looking down. Okay. So here's what we understand. There is an authority that we can project, at least in person. Okay, there's one way. And all of us sort of understand, as Chris has talked about, there are things that will make us a little bit more confident in the way we display ourselves, and the better you understand that, the more effective you're going to be. Now, when we're not in person, the task of gaining obedience becomes more challenging. So what if you have an engagement where you're just on the phone and you're trying to create a sense of compliance just over the phone? So having a really impressive sounding title and being able to, yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir. Okay, that's good. So we've got compliance, and you're going to lead them and get them to talk more and more. Okay? And authority. Brent.
You have to know what you're going to say and sound confident while you're saying it.
Okay, so sounding confident is key, right? I think you saw yesterday and today a lot of our folks participating, and some people get a little nervous, and that you convey that over the phone, and people will react to that. And so when you are trying to gain compliance over the phone, having a sense of authority is really important. Yes, sir, in the red shirt in the very back. Say that again.
Have someone else introduce you over the phone. This guy's really good. He's damn good at what he does.
Sure, and creating, and again, using conformity, that idea of social proof, right? Having someone else introduce you, because if someone else introduces you, then it must be true. Absolutely. Yes, sir?
Phrasing your questions in a way that expects compliance rather than begs a favor.
Ooh, nice. Give me an example.
Like calling up and instead saying, hey, I'm really kind of distracted tonight. Can you do me a favor? Just be like, hey, I'm this person. I need you to do this.
Absolutely. So, not really asking, right? But being able to do it in a nice way. Okay, one more.
I think kind of the other direction too is if you can ask a question related to whatever you feel like a security question, and you know their answer is going to be something, and give them a sense of confidence. They want to impress you, and you give them control.
Oh, nice. Very, very nice. But, okay, so giving someone else a sense of control or... Okay. All right, very good. So now we've talked about sort of in-person impersonation and the importance of being able to convey authority. And we've stepped back now and we've talked about vishing and voice solicitation and how it might be important to convey authority in appropriate situations, right? And again, it goes back to having your pretext match what you're trying to do. Now, let's step back even further and get into electronic communications. Okay, so if you're trying to fish or trying to create security in fish, how are you going to create a sense of authority to gain compliance through a fish? Now, there are lots of ways that we get compliance in fishing, right? We've got the Viagra, we've got the we've got the muscle gain. So there are lots of different reasons why people comply. But if you're going to use authority very specifically in a fish, how might you do that? How so? Okay, so if we can sort of create legitimacy, and how might we do that? Formatting? Oh, yes, thank you. A signature block, because clearly if it comes in an email, it's real. Yes? What else? Yeah, using spell check, always helpful. Yes? Yes, sir.
Getting as much information about someone as you can before attempting to fish them, so that it would look like a reasonable request that tip would be coming to them.
Okay, so you can see how the equation becomes a little bit more complicated as you move further and further back from direct influence, right? So if you're in person, it can be relatively easy, depending on your pretext and depending on who you are. And then as you move back to electronic communication, it can become more complex simply because you are that much more removed from that individual. Yes, sir? Ooh, familiarity. That's a great one, right? Because we do tend to respond to things that are very familiar to us. And that goes back to classical conditioning. We have been conditioned, again, if we saw, somebody describe a FedEx label to me. Everybody can see it in your head, right? How closely are you going to look for it or look at it if it looks familiar? Okay, so that's very powerful. Absolutely. Yes, sir. I can't hear you. You're going to have to get up on that chair. Official sounding language. That goes with spell check, right? All right, so now we know that authority can make a difference, and if it is appropriate to your pretext, it can be very, very powerful. We create a sense of authority in how we project ourselves and how we dress, how we communicate both orally and in written language. So now let's go a little bit further. This was also in 1961. The 60s were a great time for psychological experimentation. Al Bandura, he was very interested, and here's what you have to understand about psychology at that point. We were really into this idea that you needed to be directly rewarded in order to learn something. So, Peter, you're so smart. I worship the ground you walk on. Please continue to sit with your arms crossed in that chair because I love it. All right? So what we really believed at that time was you really had to be directly reinforced as an individual in order to learn new behavior. So this was really groundbreaking, and what he did in 1961 was take, and again, you can look up all the facts and the specifics on these studies, but he took, I believe it was 72 kids, boys and girls, and he subjected them to different conditions under which they observed an adult model playing either carefully or peacefully in a corner or being aggressive towards the Bobo doll. And these were fairly novel kinds of aggressive behaviors at the time. So it wasn't that these kids were directly punished or scolded or rewarded for anything. It's that they saw somebody else being rewarded or punished for these behaviors. And again, this was like a big deal at the time because what we realized then, again, because we are social creatures, when we see something or when we see someone else being rewarded or punished, we learn from that. And so this is just a short clip, and again, original footage from the experiment.
The model pummeled the doll with the mallet, flung it in the air.
This was 1961, so bear with me.
Kicked it repeatedly. threw it down and beat it.
That's not a beating. That's, that's fun as far as I'm concerned, but all right.
It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic.
Okay, so the point is that the kid watched the adult model taking the action and took very sort of specific novel actions. They found that if a kid saw aggressive behavior in an adult, that he or she was more likely to be verbally aggressive as well and showed additional acts of violence. So it was a really, really interesting idea, again, that we could watch someone else do something and learn from that. And again, not novel to us humans now, but back in the day it was groundbreaking. So how does this apply to you all keeping your companies safe? Say again? Don't dress like a clown. Great, yes, because, that's what I do, yes. But what's important to learn? Yes, Gary? Ooh, yes, I like it. So you can teach secure behavior through proper role modeling in teams. And again, social proof and conformity all sort of tie into that. So basically, you don't have to be rewarded and punished directly, and we know that. But really, we want to create safety through teams and role modeling. Okay, so I'm going to sort of get through this last one because this one is the one that is most interesting to people. Phil Zimbardo, back in 1971, if I'm not mistaken, did a really interesting and controversial experiment that we can't redo today for lots of different reasons. But what he did was he set up a prison in the basement of Stanford University, and took 24 healthy college-age males and randomly placed them into role of prisoner or role of guard. Now, what he found was that the experiment was supposed to last for 2 weeks, and he had to shut it down after 6 days, because what he found was that people identified so strongly with their roles that it became really sort of an unsafe sort of psychological environment. And what makes this study extremely controversial is that Zimbardo was not in the role of researcher. He was prison warden, and he became embroiled in it as well. So this is a really interesting study that talks about how roles and the roles that we place people in can really affect their behaviors and their decision making. So I'm going to show you a brief clip from this, and we'll talk about it.
In the early 1970s, an experiment on the psychology of imprisonment was carried out at Stanford University by psychologist Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues, who created their own jail in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. The students who volunteered for the study were carefully tested. Each had to be psychologically and physically healthy to participate. Some students were then randomly selected to act as prisoners, while others became guards. The researchers surprised the prisoners by having them arrested at their homes and dormitories. The prisoners went a series of rituals to establish their new lowly status. They lived in tiny cells 24 hours a day, cut off from their usual surroundings.
What is happening to prisoner 819?
Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer.
This reminds me of basic training.
5 times, make sure you remember it. Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer.
Down.
Up.
The guards, however, only worked 8-hour shifts, and they returned to their normal routines as students when off the job.
Up. 5 right sections are belly rolls. These are push-ups. Keep that back straight. Down. What do you think who he is?
What happened surprised everyone, including Zimbardo. The illusion became the reality. The boundary between the role each person was playing and his real personal identity was erased.
Keep it straight.
Nice boys became brutal guards. Healthy kids got sick.
Get in that class then.
Active ones became passive and zombie-like prisoners.
Okay, I'm not going to take the time to play all of this. You can find this on YouTube, but here's what's important to understand. Again, this was a study of roles that was supposed to last for 2 weeks. Dr. Zimbardo himself shut it down after 6 days because what happened was a research assistant came into the environment and basically said, "Do you understand what's happening here? This is immoral, what you are doing." But what's really more interesting is that the rapidity with which things started to come out in the prisoners and guards. The first prisoner had to be released for extreme stress conditions after 36 hours. Okay, so you can imagine how crazy it got in a very, very short amount of time. Again, the guards only had 8-hour shifts, but when the prisoners staged a riot, the guards actually volunteered to stay overtime to help quell the riot. So, again, this is a very scary experiment, not in terms of specifics here, but think about the environments that you create and the roles in which you place people and the kinds of conditions under which your folks have to make decisions about whether or not something is safe. So, we basically have a response to the environment. We have a response to roles. So your people get entrenched in their roles. I think a lot of you, or many of you, may be in charge of people who are customer service or call centers, where their job is to help people. And they feel good about helping people based on how happy the people are after they've gotten off the phone. And I think that, again, that's natural in all of us, right? We like to be helpful. Generally speaking, we all feel good from doing that, but you're putting your people in a position where they need to respond in a certain way, unless, again, like Bandura showed, you create an environment under which they can learn and find good alternatives to always being helpful, or to be helpful in ways that are not dangerous to your companies and your organizations. And finally, it kind of comes down to the nature of the power of the situation. Now, Dr. Zimbardo is a social psychologist, which means he believes almost ultimately in the idea that the environment can overcome the individual. And I think in many ways he has some very, very important points, again, about the situations and our environments and what we expect from our folks. So I think here's the bottom line. I've fire-hosed you with a lot of psychological experiments and mumbo-jumbo, but what it comes down to is really understanding why your people make the decisions that they do and what you can do as security people to help your folks make the decisions that are safe for your organizations, but in ways that make sense to them as well. All right, so what do all these studies have in common? Yes, psychologists are scary, creepy people. Again, yes, I will agree with you there. Yes, sir. They all involved environments that change people's decisions. Yeah, exactly. What we are talking about are the ideas of influence and manipulation. Within social engineering, we do distinguish the difference between influence and manipulation. Here's the bottom line. If you are trying to create safe environments for your companies that really care about the safety of your people and your organizations and your information, what we don't want to do is scare people into or make people feel bad enough, because that's not going to affect the security of your groups. What we want is for people to be a team and to create an environment under which good decisions can be made and people want to make the right decisions. And so we're really careful about, not making people cry and not making people fearful of their jobs, because that really isn't going to teach them how to be safe. So here's the bottom line right here. We can control the things that control the choices that humans make. If we have an understanding of that, and again, it's not the studies that are important, but the concepts behind them, we have to understand that authority makes a difference, the roles in which we place people make a difference, how we model good, safe behavior, those all make a difference, and it will affect our ability to create safety within our organizations. So, as social engineers, take away this message. We want you to understand why people respond in certain ways. I will agree that there is a certain percentage of the population that will click on a fish no matter what, over and over and over again. I know. But for the most part, people are going to respond in certain ways because the environment that's been created will nudge them in a certain direction. You can develop, if you understand this stuff, you can develop good education that's going to mitigate these tendencies as much as possible and make changes to your environment, make changes to the roles and the conditions under which your people have to make decisions, and that's going to go a long ways towards making your organization safe. But really, when it comes down to it, Dr. Freud said it best, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And that's pretty much it. I think I can take one or two quick questions. Yes, sir? And your question is? Yes, and I would say that depends, right? Depends on your organization, depends on the personalities, depends on the teams. One more. Yes, sir? So how do we break the conditioning? And unfortunately, since we are opposed to using electrical shocks, generally speaking, on our population, it does come down to repetition. And I know it gets boring for you guys, and I know it gets time-consuming, but people need to hear over and over and over again, here are the conditions, here are the choices I have to make, and here is the way to make that choice. And that's why we kind of talk about education being a continual process and necessary all the time. Okay, one more.
Is that really breaking conformity or just reestablishing a different set of rules?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think we could talk about this one for a very long time and argue, but you're right, what we're doing is modeling different behavior and creating different environment and creating sort of conformity along a more safe path, and I think that's a great point to make. Thank you very much, sir. Okay, that's all the time I have. I think clearly the man who pays the bills is the best boss I've ever had. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.